Well, good evening, everyone. Good to see you. Welcome back to our book study, which we'll get started with it in just a moment. I've received these to share with you, and so they're from EMI. Many of you know that recently BJ and Katie Elkins addressed all of us about the work they are going to be doing through, I believe it's Engineering Ministries International. And so what I'm going to do, these are little pamphlets, and these are business cards with their information on them. What I'm going to do is put them on the front of this pew right here on your way out tonight. Why don't you go ahead and pick one up? That just allows you to have detailed information on stuff that they're doing. And so we're going to pray for them before we begin. Again, doing a book study is a bit odd from this kind of dynamic. Normally it works best around a table, but we're just kind of doing the best we can. I do know some people are watching through the live stream, and so if you ask a question, don't be insulted if I kind of repeat it back to you or summarize the content. That's for the people who are watching who can't hear you when you're asking a question. So with that said, let's pray together and we'll begin. Father, we thank you so much for the work that you are doing in us. You've called us to live out lives of love and service to Jesus, love and service to our neighbor. You've equipped us with your word and you've sent us out. And so we pray that in our vocations, in our work that you've given to us, in our families, in places of employment, and in, right here in this church, that you would continue to be faithful to provide us with all that we need, to fit us for service in this life. And I pray, Father, that you would help this time to be beneficial to us, to help us get a sense of the place that we're living in, and not just so we can be aware, but so that we can respond, so that we can speak wisely, intelligently, lovingly to the culture around us. Thank you for your servant, Carl Truman, who's written this book for us. We pray that it would bear fruit in the church and beyond, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So the reading that you had for this week was the introduction plus the first half of chapter 1. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the introduction, unless you've got stuff you want to bring out from it, and that's kind of going to shape a lot of our time here. So I've got a sort of a presentation that I've put together of highlights from our reading that I thought were important or interesting. But if you want to jump in with something, please, you are absolutely welcome to do so. I'm not going to cover everything in the chapter. I don't even know if I'm going to get all the way through what I put together. Kind of depends on where the discussion takes us. And so I'm going to highlight some things. I'm going to skip over some things. Feel free to bring stuff out that I skip over. And I do want to also mention, if you are on Facebook, if you use the Facebook, we do have a group that we've started just for all of us who are reading this book together. So you can go over to my profile. I've got a link in there somewhere in the feed where you can request to join that group, and I'll periodically be putting up different things. I'll definitely put up the reading assignments for each week, so if you forget, it goes on the screen here right at the end, but not for very long. So if you forget that, that'll be in the Facebook group as well. So, chapter 1 and the introduction together mention three key figures, three important figures that I'm not going to talk a whole lot about tonight, and because it's really, to talk about them, to spend a lot of time talking about them wouldn't be as helpful as just getting into the content of what they said. So Philip Reef is one you'll hear Truman referencing quite a lot. He's the guy in the top left who kind of looks like John Cleese from the Ministry of Silly Walks. The bottom one is Charles Taylor, and then the top right is Alistair McIntyre. All these guys are philosophers of one stripe of another. Charles Taylor's a philosopher, actually. Philip Reef is a psychological sociologist, and Alistair McIntyre is an ethicist, all right? And so originally, I don't know if you spotted this in the introduction or maybe in the acknowledgments, originally the book project started Truman trying to write about just Philip Reef, and it grew into this much larger project, taking these three guys and then not just covering Reef's work, but a bunch of others. So with that in mind, a term that comes up quite a lot in the chapter, and one we started talking about last week, was the social imaginary, okay? Social imaginary, which is, it's really important you understand this term, it's how ordinary people imagine their world. And it's how we then make sense of our behavior in it. It's not really expressed in words. That's so important. So in other words, the social imaginary that you live in, nobody sat you down and explained it to you. It just is, right? And it's really even hard to talk about it because it's talking about it is trying to do maintenance on a car while the car is in motion, right? You're in the car, so it's really hard to get outside and do maintenance. So not really expressed in words, but rather in images, stories, and legends. And that's a whole other conversation then as to why movies and television in particular are so powerful in communicating worldview and social imaginary to you. And then third, it gives public legitimacy to actions and ideas. That is, if people do things that are in harmony with the social imaginary, most of the population doesn't bat an eye, or maybe defends them, as the case may be. So it gives public legitimacy to actions and to ideas. And so to try and kind of get at this, what I talked about last week is if you've got a kid that's grown up just watching a lot of movies, and in every movie, the characters, if they are married characters, a husband and a wife, they're always fighting and miserable all the time. Okay, that child most likely, unless he has some kind of counterexample, is going to grow up thinking marriage is miserable, right? Because those are the images, that's the story he's been told. It's a weak example, but to try to get at what social imaginary is, that's the best I do.
What you used to call zeitgeist?
Yes. Zeitgeist, and it's distinct from worldview. Worldview is more like the individual. And with the way the individual sees the world within their kind of social imaginary. Social imaginary is all of us. Spirit of the age. But social imaginary also has to do with particular customs and No, you're fine. Please.
So is it different than what the Greeks called paideia?
I don't know. When I said, is it different from paideia, the Greek term paideia? I'm not sure. Yes, because paideia has to do with education, right?
But so, it's also the culture and the air you breathe.
Right.
But to me, it has that connotation of we're doing this on purpose.
Yeah.
Whereas social imaginary almost seems like it's accidental.
Yes.
Except that he talks about the elites.
Right.
It down. On purpose.
Correct. Yeah.
The heritage you pass down.
Yes. But I would say not always intentionally. So Truman is using social imaginary to answer the question, how is it that what these cultural elites talk about does eventually filter down? Nobody went and took their classes, but apparently what they said and taught is in us. And how did that happen? Social imaginary is part of the attempt to get at that question. Very good question. So one that came up a lot in the book, the example that Truman used, sorry. So this brings us back to where we started last week, which was, can you explain water to a fish? That's what it's like trying to talk about social imaginary or worldview or zeitgeist or a lot of these concepts. It's because you're in it, and it's all around you, and again, it simply is. So I am a woman trapped in a man's body. That is the statement that Truman kept coming back to again and again, and using that as a kind of here's this phrase that you might hear today, and he used his grandfather, that to my grandfather would have made no sense whatsoever, okay? But it makes more sense today, and if you don't know, that is the Health and Human Services Secretary for the state of Pennsylvania. Assistant?
No, she's the assistant to the national.
Oh, he's the assistant to the, okay, well, there you go. And so Truman calls this an oddly Cartesian notion. And that's a reference to Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am. And so Truman takes that concept and said, this has really taken root among us. I think I am a woman, therefore I am a woman, right? And so he attributes some of that to Descartes and others like him. Let's see, sorry, some of my notes are out of order here. Charles Taylor's definition of the social imaginary, he says, the way ordinary people imagine their surroundings, carried in images, stories, and legends, giving a common understanding of what makes possible. Common practices, it's the thing that makes possible our common practices together, widely shared sense of legitimacy. It is the way people think together about the world, how they imagine it to be, okay? The totality of the way we understand the world, as well as how we make sense of our behavior in it. That's the hook I kept hanging social imaginary on, was explanation of behavior. explanation of behavior. That's really where it's going to come into play. So then Truman, at one point in the book, I need to go through this. So I'm a woman trapped in a man's body would not have made sense to previous generations, but let's just say, for a weird reason, seems intuitively correct in our present moment in history and culture to affirm someone in his or her chosen identity, and hurtful not to do so, right? Not news to any of you, I don't think. Such that if you don't, so actually what I just did was I referred to this individual here as he, right? There's now a word for that. It's called dead naming, yeah? Which is you are referring to them according to the designation that the person they used to be, their dead self, not their present living self. And as of yet, I'll suffer no legal consequences for speaking this way. But hey, that's why we're putting it on YouTube, so there'll be enough evidence to convict me. No one decided this attitude for us or for the wider culture. It is part of the social imaginary. And so it simply feels natural or feels obviously correct to many in our present cultural moment. Any questions so far? Is that at least making sense? I'm not endorsing it as good, if that's not clear. I'm trying to explain, again, how it is kind of showing you the roots of we're looking around and seeing fruit, and I'm trying to explain root. All right? So, yeah. All right. Who do you think decided? That's, yep. Yes. Yeah. So the point Mom just made is that could we credit political parties with decided this attitude for us? I would say so I would only push back a little and say I don't know if they decided it. They certainly are enforcing it with either shame or a mockery or things like that. I would put the decision higher up at maybe the philosophical level, as Truman does. He's saying a lot of this originated in philosophers teaching about human nature, which then gets read by the academics, who then teach, and then their students go on to carry out their teaching. Well, it would be interesting to reflect on what sorts of institutions does our political elite graduate from. I don't know the numbers on that, but that would be an interesting little experiment.
The politicians will just pander to what they feel like
Right.
is most popular.
Right.
Popularized from several different angles. And I think some people, it is strictly intuitive.
Yes.
This is just, you came up in it. So all the shows you watch, it's in what everybody is talking about on social media, like everything. Other people are more, like I come at it more from how the influence of evolution has led to this view of humans and all this kind of stuff, whereas somebody who has more of a, background in philosophy probably knows all the philosophers that led to this. Somebody who knows, I think different people have different levels that they can trace
Yes.
this social imaginary
Right.
back to.
Yeah, so there are different, you might say, tributaries or contributing factors to social imaginary, not just philosophy. That's fair.
Yeah, but the politician can legitimately.
Yeah, and I guess the reason why I would hold back on, it's almost like to say the politicians have decided this for us, it's giving them too much credit. I don't think they're that smart. I mean, it's like, it's enforced, and they're going along with what they perceive to get them votes or perceive to get them popularity. But yeah,
Yeah, I think maybe considering the phrase would be that there's not a singular
right.
they.
Yeah, that's good.
There is not a singular they
That's
decider.
good.
It is, you could say they're forcing this on us, but they could equally be some philosopher
Right.
or be, social justice.
Yeah, that's kind of what Daniel was saying. The they is wider than yeah.
The thing that's interesting is that Christians seem so concerned with what the source of this is.
Right.
And like something you run into in evangelism a lot is like you have to explain
Yes.
to the non-Christian why they think the way they think. Like they
Yep.
don't know. It's
Right.
just like you said, like it says, it's just intuitive.
And that's exactly why we're talking about it.
Yeah.
And I'm to be clear, I'm wanting us to move then. Oh, that's so helpful, Daniel. I'm wanting us to move So what Daniel just said was that sometimes in conversations with unbelievers, you almost have to explain to them, not to sound condescending, but you almost have to explain to them the roots of this stuff, because they're not entirely aware of where this comes from. I'm not saying that then to do evangelism, you have to be able to engage in like a 20-minute conversation about social imaginary, but before we get to easily being able to summarize a lot of this, we might have to kind of plot out a bit slower first. Now, yeah, sure, yeah.
You know, you might even take it even further and say, well, who supports the colleges and the universities where these precepts are being taught?
Yeah.
If it's not the wealthy and
Right.
the politicians, et cetera, then you almost get into a chicken and the egg.
Yeah.
type of,
That's true. That's true. Right. That's a good point. Yeah, and so this I found particularly helpful. At one point in the chapter, Truman talks about this progression, that if you want to talk about where does we're talking about roots of some of these things. So if you have he starts with just the act of like sexual promiscuity. He's like, which is not new. Like it's been around as long as there have been humans and sinners. What happens though, what can happen in a culture, is that you get to facilitation, which in our case would be invention of the birth control pill and contraception and stuff like that. Now, in this present moment, I'm not like saying any of that's a bad thing, but what it has led to in our present moment, you have facilitation of it, and then you have consequences avoided, right? So it's one thing for let's just say the church in a culture to say sexual promiscuity is bad, right? Christians have always been saying that. But now we occupy a different cultural moment where the consequences of the sin can be avoided. From there, if you can avoid the consequences, it's much easier to justify the behavior, okay? And if you can justify the behavior, it is not long before the behavior is accepted. There's one piece missing from this, which is where we are presently, which is, I would say, where behavior is celebrated. That's kind of the last step in this progression that Truman doesn't talk about so much, perhaps yet. But I found that helpful, just to kind of envision, if you're wondering how did we get here. You've got promiscuous behavior, and then technology to facilitate it, birth control, and then antibiotics, etc. Once consequences can be avoided, behavior becomes justifiable, and then behavior becomes more acceptable. And so that for me is just a helpful trajectory of understanding how some things that used to be culturally taboo, or if they happened, you didn't talk about them. Now it's like, not only is it okay to talk about them, but it's actually sort of encouraged that you're considered to be a more kind of frank and honest and liberated person if you can talk about them. So any questions or thoughts on this? And you can do this with lots of different kind of aspects of sin in society. But the next bit is the one that I think had the most questions. And that's, we're going to talk about, if you're curious about the pronunciation, we're going to talk about mimesis and poiesis, okay? Mimesis and poiesis. Don't be afraid of the words, because they're fun. So mimesis, okay? Mimesis is a term that lets us talk about a mimetic, same word, just different use, noun and adjective, a mimetic view of reality, okay? So mimesis and poiesis both have to do with how we look at reality. So a mimetic view is the world has order and meaning to it. You have to discover that order and meaning and then conform yourself to it, okay? Like a really easy example of this, the kind of the starkest way to put it would be like gravity. Once you learn about gravity, once you discover it, you have to conform yourself to it. Otherwise, it will conform you if you try to jump off a high place or something. And so the world has order. The world has kind of, maybe you can think of it in terms of natural laws, and you have to discover those things, and then you have to change you to fit into reality. Okay? A poietic view, that's the next one. There we go. The world is raw material, stuff that you can use to build your own meaning. You see the difference? Okay? One says, this is how the world is. The other one says, the world is what I want it to be. And so a mimetic view says reality is my boss, just to put it kind of really concretely. The poietic, not poetic, but poietic, the poietic view says reality is my workshop, and I can fiddle around with it and fool around with it and mess with it and construct the reality that I want. And you can perhaps already see how we can use these terms to explain, again, kind of the revolution of the last few decades. And for me, the most enjoyable part of the chapter was when he brings this over to an analogy about farming. And he says, either if you're a farmer, you'd better have a mimetic view of reality, okay? Because you're going to work the land at appropriate times and seasons, or you die, okay? And so you have a very mimetic view of reality. You understand that I have to cooperate with nature like this, or I die, okay? As technology progresses then, what happens is it provides us more and more distance from a mimetic view. Okay? So as we get more and more comfortable and secure, and I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing in and of itself. I like that I can go to Kroger and buy whatever I want and as much as I want. That's a wonderful comfort. Okay? I mean, for heaven's sakes, we placed a phone call and somebody brought us 20 pizzas tonight. That's amazing. I mean, that in terms of world history, that's a miracle, okay? Yeah, it's witchcraft. And so as technology progresses, it has a tendency to pull us out more and more of a mimetic view because we feel really empowered. I mean, if you just think about how many things were threats to people of earlier ages that are not threats to us. The exceptions, there are still exceptions, like hurricanes can still freak us out, right? Tornadoes can still freak us out. So stuff with the weather, I mean, still makes us feel that big, or it can. Beyond that, there's just a whole lot that we have kind of exercised control over, at least or so we think. Technology provides us safety and distance from the consequences of violating the natural order. Okay? Safety from the consequences of violating the natural order. So it tends to be we think we're stronger than we actually are. Or at least more clever and creative and defended. That's not the right word, but and I thought about this because Truman also talks about how this can even affect your concept of distance, right? So if you would have said to a person, let's say 200 years ago, well, where is that place where I need to go? Well, it's 15 miles away. Oh, okay. Get the horse, maybe. Or you might be walking. You're going to be walking a long time, right? Now for us, it's 15 miles away. Oh, well, I'll be there in a little bit. It won't take me long at all. It just has, and so that actually got me thinking, why do we call it a 5K rather than 3 miles or 3.1 miles? It's probably so we can distinguish. When we hear miles, we think I'll drive it. When we hear K, we think I got to walk it. I don't know if that's true, but I think maybe that's part of the reason. We think, 5K, that means I have to, run it or walk it. That sounds a lot longer. At least maybe to keep that distinction straight. What do you guys think about that? I'm just kind of throwing a lot at you. But in terms of, perception.
Add to your hurricane.
Yes.
COVID-19.
Right. Oh, man. Hasn't COVID-19 impacted how safe we feel? Certainly. How safe we feel, for heaven's sake. We're not there yet. Sorry.
Yeah, I pushed back a little against that. I just had a thought on
Yeah,
that
go on.
as well. And it's something you run into in science all the time. We're not breaking, altering, or creating any new natural laws. We're still
Right.
subject to the authority of the natural laws, but the better we understand them, the better we can take advantage
Yes.
of the opportunities they provide. So it's kind of
Yes.
a shallow feeling that we're gaining some kind of authority over nature,
Mm-hmm.
completely subject to nature,
Right.
but we become better stewards of it in some areas.
Yes.
We just understand it better, so we can manipulate it.
Right.
But anyway,
Wouldn't you say we do feel safer from the consequences of violating it?
yeah, but I'm just saying it's a surface level interpretation.
Sure.
When you actually look at the deeper level,
Mm-hmm.
the more we've discovered, the more interconnected
Right. I'm not saying we're actually safer. Yeah.
When I read that,
Yeah.
that's what I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that it's such a illusion.
Yeah. I would agree. Yeah.
Which underscores the good doctor's point all forwards. You're so safe and secure until there is something you can't see, and then radically nothing is on the store shelves.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Everything vanished off the store shelves once. Once we got scared. And so that's kind of some different conversations going on here. All of them good, but one of them is that how quickly the illusion of control can disappear. I think part of what you're saying, Daniel, is that you're emphasizing that illusion of control really is an illusion, right?
Yeah, even in the areas where, obviously a tornado shows you how powerless you are.
Right.
But even the stuff we think we control,
Right.
we genetically modify a plant,
Yep.
we're still subject to the laws of how DNA works,
Yes.
reproduction and things like that. We can just manipulate it a little bit, but we aren't creating anything new. We haven't actually overpowered any natural law.
Correct.
We're just
Yeah.
in alignment.
Yeah, I think I would agree. We're not actually creating any natural law or lessening the power of any natural law or its reality to us.
But
Yeah.
it's an illusion that, is giving scientists a lot of power.
It's a potent illusion, yeah. So then he starts talking about Philip Reef, this guy, and brings forward these images of how culture has developed in its sense of the self, okay? All right, which is a little bit difficult to grasp. What does sense of self mean? At least to get us started, it just means what sort of being am I in this society, in this place that I exist in. Traditional culture says your self is something you learn and you're given, you don't create it. Some have gone so far as to just call this the Eastern view because you can't find it in the West really anymore. Some have just gone so far as to call it the Eastern view. That Tim Keller, for instance, calls this view of the self, he just says it's the Eastern view, that your self is something you learn and you're given, you don't create it. All right, and then Truman walks you through these phases using Reef's work. He says, so we'll start with, for instance, the ancient Greeks, and they had the culture of the political man, all right? So for the Greeks, what was a self? What was a person? Well, he was a person that participated in civic life. Okay, he goes to the assemblies, he goes to the Areopagus, he debates with people, he thinks through ideas. Okay, but he always belongs to a people. He's part of something bigger than himself. Okay, so that's political man, and then later on you have religious man. So then we think Middle Ages. Okay, so what did it mean to be a self, be a person in this culture? Well, it meant that you were religious. It meant that you went to mass. It meant that you went through all the practices and the rituals. And it meant from earliest ages you were instructed in those rituals and kind of how they worked and what they meant. And then from there, beyond just participation in religious life, which is religious man, you have the Industrial Revolution and the modern age, which brings us the economic man, okay? So I've read a lot of books, that's actually probably not true. I've read a few books on productivity, right? Which is the concept. I heard somebody recently say productivity is for robots, you're a human. I kind of like that, actually. It makes me think a little bit more about the stuff that I've read. But I read a lot of Michael Hyatt. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's been very helpful to me in kind of sorting out how to, get some healthy productivity rhythms in life. But the economic man, his job, his reason for existence is to produce things or create things or make money from the things. And, it's not entirely meant to sound selfish. Make money so he can feed his family. Make money so he can take care of people around him. Sure, fine. That's part of this conception of economic man, though. That's really what's most important for him. Fourth, to bring you up to the present day, is psychological man. Okay, so Reef put forward this idea that what we really are today, after Sigmund Freud, who really invented psychology, everything after him is kind of footnotes. Psychological man. Psychological man is on an inward quest for personal happiness. So I hope what you notice in the four things that I just gave you, way different motivations and goals for each one, okay? And so let me see. I want to jump to, page 47. I marked this because I thought it was so compelling. I wanted to read it to you. If I had been, take for example the issue of job satisfaction, something that is significant for most adults. My grandfather left school at 15, spent the rest of his life as a sheet metal worker in a factory in Birmingham, the industrial heartland of England. If he had been asked if he found satisfaction in his work, there is a distinct possibility he would not have understood the question, given that it reflects the concerns of psychological man's world to which he did not belong. If he did understand, he probably would have answered in terms of whether his work gave him the money to put food on his family's table, shoes on his children's feet. If it did so, then yes, his job satisfied him. Okay? His needs were the needs of his family. And in enabling him to meet those needs, his work gave him satisfaction. My grandfather was, if anything, economic man, whose economic production and the results of that for others were the key to his sense of self. Okay? If I am asked, this is Truman talking, if you ask me the same question, my instinct is to talk about the pleasure that teaching gives me, or the sense of personal fulfillment I feel when a student learns a new idea or becomes excited about some concept as a result of my classes. The difference is stark. For my grandfather, job satisfaction was empirical, outwardly directed, and unrelated to his psychological state. For members of my generation and subsequent generations, the issue of feeling is central. Okay? Issue of feeling is central. And again, I wonder, I couldn't think of any examples off the top of my head, but I wonder if you can think of any movies or stories today where economic man is usually the dad, who's like too busy for anybody, and then the children are usually psychological man, and they've got to soften up the big bully who's economic man and bring him into understanding of how he should be. I'm just saying.
Rudy.
What?
Rudy.
Rudy. Okay, it's been a long time. I think I saw it in high school. That's at least half the Hallmark movies. And so it's, but even that arc in a story in a movie, like notice a good way, if you want to know what a movie is preaching at you, watch who the villains and heroes are. Like really notice who the villains and heroes are, and why are they villains, and why are they heroes. And so Truman starts talking about the role of a therapist in different cultures, even before we had therapy by a psychological understanding. He said, for a religious man, his priest was his therapist, in that the therapist's job, the priest's job, was to train people in the rituals, the language, the doctrines, the symbols. Why, though? Why? Not just so they have the knowledge. Why? So they can... Somebody help me. Yeah, so they can be part of the community, right? Yeah. It forms them. So they learn, not just for the sake of learning, but so they can join the community, right? Today, therapy is not about socializing an individual. It's about protecting an individual from the society. Yeah? So whatever society is creating around them and smothering their ability to simply be themselves, that's the bad thing, right? And so, political man, to go through that again, political man is committed to his assembly, right? Areopagus, civic life, things like that. Medieval religious man is committed to his church. 20th century factory worker, economic man is committed to his trade union, or to his, what did Truman say, working man's club. In all cases, it's something outside themselves. Psychological man is committed to himself, finding himself, understanding himself. In relation to others, yes, but that impulse for self-expression. And which struck me while I was reading. I thought, man, so in our context then, just how important does it become to love your neighbor as you love yourself? Maybe so much more, yeah.
Is it me? But each of those phases, to me, it seems like you see a diminishment of collective
Yeah. Yes.
and more individualism. And I'm not making a values call, but I noticed it seemed like there was a progression there.
Yes, Eddie pointed out that with each kind of progression, there's a growing sense of, what did you say? Not just individualism and a lessening of collectivism. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I had an image. I forgot to put it in the presentation, but there's a book that I found just on Google while kind of looking at some of these ideas, and it was called How to Be an Individual, or How Not to Conform. That's what it was. How Not to Conform, and the subtitle was just all about understanding yourself and realizing yourself and knowing yourself. And so yeah, Cliff.
Aren't each of these steps of individualism that you're talking about, how they're based on individual fulfillment?
Yes.
I mean,
Each one brings with it a sense of fulfillment. Each one has a different fulfillment goal, we might say. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
each individual has to have fulfillment
Mm-hmm.
according to the goals that they have set for themselves, and even many people abandon their goals knowing that they cannot fulfill them and become fulfilled with
Right.
something else.
Right. Yeah. No, so I got in trouble last time because somebody asked the question, which is like the guillotine question. Thank you very much, whoever asked it, which is like, how does this take shape in the church? So I will give you something to think about, okay? Something to think about, which is before, I would argue, well, actually, let me qualify this a bit. Before the advent of the modern psychological self and defining myself by achieving goals and being at peace with myself, you didn't see so much. I won't say you didn't see it all, but you didn't see so much the language of calling to talk about what it is I'm supposed to do, right? So calling in the New Testament is mainly concerns salvation, not job or vocation or what you're going to do with your life. And so a distinction I tend to make here, and this is a whole other conversation, maybe I'm opening up a dangerous box, but if somebody says, Bryan, did you feel called to be or were you called to be a pastor? Somebody asked me that. Were you called to be a pastor? I would say, yeah. The congregation at Grace Presbyterian Church called me on May 31st, 2015. Now, that's not what most people mean when they're asking, right? They're asking, did you have this sort of internal sense that you ought to be a pastor? And I would say I did, but that's really not what pushed me into ministry. What pushed me into ministry was I learned about my gifts, spiritual gifting, as best I could understand it. It seemed to me this would be the best place to exercise those gifts and to serve God's people. What? In a community. Yeah, Steve.
There was a concept of calling came from the Reformation.
Yes.
Calvin, he was
Yes.
the value of work is a calling of God in whatever vocation you're in.
Right.
So there is that aspect.
It's there. Right. Yeah. I wouldn't say we invented it. No, absolutely not. But that the idea of kind of God gives you a vocation that you have to discover and go do. Again, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that it would be that's a distinctly we'll say Reformation on way of talking about vocation, I think. And again, I'm not saying it doesn't exist before then. It's just become a lot more common, I think, to simply speak of, well, what are you going to do? Well, this is what I'm called to. Okay. Yeah. So in terms of that kind of vocabulary, so as I read this, I thought I'm really weird in terms of, and y'all already know that, but I'm going to tell you another way that you don't know that I'm weird, and that is that I am kind of an outlier here in terms of understanding and identity in terms of the self. So one of the things I learned looking back is that I went to a university, Liberty University in Virginia, that was quite happy to give me an identity, right? As I think lots of institutions are. And so that identity was like a very strict Southern Baptist identity that didn't drink and didn't dance and didn't chew and didn't go with girls who do, and all those things, and didn't laugh. But and I'm exaggerating, but and that for me really kind of became an identity that I was given from an institution, I think, in part, for a long time. Oh man, sorry. I'm trying to figure out how to say this. What that did then, kind of unexpectedly for me, was that I had adopted a set of values that were in some ways different from like the values of my extended family. And so we'd like go on vacation, and I was kind of a stick in the mud about some things, and didn't just kind of relax and have fun with a lot of the family. But there came a turning point where I started to root my identity in not just my faith in the scriptures, but actually in my family, because I saw a lot more of myself in them than I'd care to admit. And so then I gained this sense of identity from family. Like the way I would summarize it, it sounds weird, but that I remember distinctly, like one family vacation we went on, I felt like saying that I went on the vacation a Liberty student and came home a Rhodes. Really, like I know that sounds weird, but I was really able to gain a sense of rootedness and identity in where I came from, not just of what I was given from an institution. There's a little bit about me. So we're kind of coming to the end here of this. We'll get there in just a minute. This bit, but so Truman talks about institutions, political institutions, religious institutions, educational institutions, and how under the thinking of psychological man, they cease to become places of formation, and they instead become places of self-expression or performance. Places where you have to be allowed to be your authentic self, to give expression of who you are on the inside, that becomes the purpose, so to speak, of institutions. Let's see, 49. Outward institutions become, in effect, the servants of the individual and her sense of well-being. In fact, I'll press it further. Institutions cease to be places for the formation of individuals via practices and disciplines that allow them to take their place in society. Instead, they become platforms for performance, where individuals are allowed to be their authentic selves, because they're allowed to give expression to who they are on the inside. This helps explain, in part, the concern in recent years over making the classroom a safe space. That is, a place where students go not to be exposed to ideas that may challenge their deepest beliefs and commitments. That was part of what was traditionally considered to be the role of education. But rather, they go to be affirmed and reassured. While hostile commentators berate this tendency as caused by the hypersensitivity of a generation of snowflakes, it is actually the result of the slow but steady psychologizing of the self and the triumph of inward-directed therapeutic categories, therapy, over traditional outward-directed educational philosophies. Yeah. Robert.
The word, what came to me is individualism. Is where God says in Philippians, think more highly of others than yourself.
Yeah.
Because the tragedy with individualism is what God's saying is happening more and more right now. Men will be lovers of themselves, they'll be boastful, they'll be prideful. And if you do what God says to put others ahead of yourself instead of me individual,
Right.
that's where we're headed.
Yeah, so,
Lovers of yourself,
yeah.
boastful and prideful, and that's what our country is trying to say. If you're a woman, but you think
Right.
you're a man,
Right. So this is what Truman's talking about when he talks about expressive individualism. So we've talked about this movement where culturally we're less collectivistic, more individualistic. But the way Truman understands individualism today, it's more than that. It's expressive individualism, right? So then that moves just beyond, like, it's more important to be an individual than to be part of the community. Now we've moved to expression of myself, kind of my insides expressing themselves, my feelings expressing themselves is is actually how I am an individual. Like that's what it means. And if you keep me from doing that, you are hurting me. That's the idea. Yeah. And so the worst thing that could ever happen to you is to have your identity suppressed. And so you have to be an expressive individual to be at peace with yourself, to kind of have an internal what do you call it? Sense of okayness. Yeah. Thoughts on this? Yeah.
Yeah, just kind of an extreme example of that that I sometimes have to deal with is there are a group of doctors called surgeons that perform a job that takes a lot of self-confidence. I mean, you got to
Sure.
give them that. But a lot of times they justify some of their behaviors by saying, I have to be almost prideful to the point of arrogance because of the decisions I make on a daily basis. I have to have complete confidence in what I'm doing. And it only rides so far because, you know, that can be expressed in a hurtful way to other people sometimes, especially if they expect the same level of, quote, perfection from the people that work with them as they do expect of themselves. So it's been an interesting thing over the last couple of years to have this little discussion with them at times, where it is hard to argue that they have to have a certain level of that almost prideful confidence in their own ability so that they can do what they do.
Yeah.
In any event.
Yeah.
That sort of takes us down a rabbit trail a little bit.
Yeah, but a good one. Yeah, and so what aspects of a person's job or vocation might demand that they behave in a certain way? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Yeah. So your job is going to have behavioral expectations on it, and sometimes could be good expectations or bad expectations, or also excuses. A lot becomes excusable sometimes based on your vocation. I think personality tests can do this. Right? So it's like, well, no, I'm not a jerk. I'm just an Enneagram 5 or whatever the case may be. I don't even know. Sorry, I don't know Enneagram stuff, but I'm just winging that. But it's one of those things that I've seen very commonly happen. And I love personality tests, by the way. They're lots of fun. I like to take them. They're fun. But there can be a very quick tendency to excuse your sin. And so I think part of if you want to know what good does a personality test serve, I would say it's going to show you your sin areas, the sins you are most prone. If you view it that way, it can be really, really helpful. Mr. Frank.
The opening statement, the woman said, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body
Yep.
and expressing herself.
Yep.
She makes a declarative sentence, but she has absolutely no supporting evidence. So how do we draw conclusions on that are valid?
Right. Yeah, and so you're correct. You're thinking like economic man who wants proof for things. But yeah, no, I mean you're right. You're right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Right. Right. Yeah.
This express yourself idea that is forthwith right now, that is, as we've seen, and here I go political, but that's being tamped down by the person that has an insatiable thirst for power.
Self-expression is being tamped down by? Okay.
You can't express, you cannot go on, I cannot go on YouTube and express a conservative view without Facebook,
Sure.
Twitter, or whomever. I mean,
You'll get pushback for it, no question.
yeah,
Yeah.
not only pushback, but absolutely cut off. I'm the President of the United States.
Okay.
Cut
Yeah.
off completely from any
Right.
expression whatsoever,
Yeah.
good, bad, or ugly.
Yeah.
So have personal identity is short-lived.
So you're actually starting to get into the second half of the chapter. So it's what we'll read in the coming week, which is where he talks about hate speech. And how does the concept of hate speech factor into this? And essentially it's because for psychological man, hateful speech becomes the most dangerous kind of weapon because it's suppressing him or keeping him.
Where this tied in, the
Yeah.
psychological man.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not reading the book.
No, that's okay.
I just participate.
I'm trying to teach this in such a way so that if you're not reading the book, you're still getting something out of it. So you haven't crashed our party. Yeah.
I'm curious what you think. If you look back at political man and even religious man, the ultimate goal was human flourishing. So
Yes.
if you commit yourself to this outward
Right.
community, to this outward thing, you're going to benefit as an individual.
Yes.
By the time you get the psychological man, would he say that, oh, because I focus on myself, the community is then going to benefit? Which is sad.
What a good observation. So in the first three, political man, religious man, and what was the third one? Economic man. Thank you. Economic man. It was outward facing in some sense. And so is psychological man outward facing at all? Is there even a concern for how what I'm doing is best for the community?
Well, you can't love others unless you love yourself, Brian.
That's troubling to put it mildly, because I don't know. I'd have to think about that. That's good. Yes, Steve.
I guess
And then
you could say something like, if everybody in the world felt totally self-actualized and
Yep.
identified, then we'd have
Yeah.
perfect society.
I think that is the assumption.
That's sort of what
Yes,
they're doing.
I think that is the assumption. Yeah.
Well, your question kind of speaks to what I've been thinking this whole time, which is that I personally grew up in a family that didn't hold Christian views and was very much a proponent. Like I grew up in the thinking of that you and yourself and fulfilling yourself is very important, and that I grew up like this, that you need to go to a university and you need to study what feels right to you, and I grew up this way, and I never thought about it before, but I have a very hard time participating in community. Like I'm very glad that I married Will because he doesn't have that. He grew up in a family that valued being a part of something, and I did not.
Yeah.
And so if I was on my own, I would have a very hard time even getting myself to come to church, even though I'm a Christian, and I know it's important. Like it would be a struggle. Like I would be, I would have such a hard time just getting myself through the door. Like it's just so not natural for me, to do that, because the idea of thinking about a community of people and going out of my way and taking my time and my money and my energy, to put it into something that doesn't have to do with me and my family specifically.
Yeah.
It's important to me, but it's such, like, I have to force myself.
Yeah.
I have to force myself. It's a temptation. So I think that probably a lot of people in today's culture are like that.
I agree 110%.
People are like me, and thank God I've been saved, and I love Jesus, and he gave me a family to help me, be part of other things, but I can identify with this so much. It helps me to see. I mean, I majored in psychology, like, cause this is all, so if y'all know anybody who can relate to all of this, I definitely can.
And I bet sharing what you just shared is super easy for you, right? Thank you. Oh, thank you. Yeah, because you expressed yourself. Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. That's a hard thing to share, I think. And that's perfectly illustrates some things that we're looking at here. And it's, I think you're right. I think there's a growing discomfort with that presently. And then there's a growing isolation. I've got a cousin who I still don't know if he can call and talk to the pizza guy. He's in his 20s. And I knew that when he was in his late teens, he couldn't do it. No. If we're going to order food, you have to order it. I'm not calling. I'm not doing that. And I don't think he's alone. But yeah.
I was saying that progression earlier from, and it was talking about
Hopefully he's not watching.
sin or whatever was facilitated, avoided consequences, but even isolation
Yeah.
can only really, there are consequences, natural consequences. If it's you out in the wilderness,
Yeah.
you'd really like to have someone else to help you sharpen
Yeah.
sticks.
Yep.
And so even isolation, even introversion, even
Yep.
privately extreme levels of that are you can only have them so long before it's like,
Yes.
oh, I need community
Yeah.
to afford privacy.
This is great. You guys are getting into the next part of the chapter because he talks about how to actually have a healthy identity. You have to have others. Even a sense of your own individual identity, you need other people in order to make it happen. I did want to read this part. This is from the next part that we'll read. Let's see. To turn to the psychological self is so fundamentally iconoclastic with regard to traditional moral codes, meaning you find moral codes and you destroy them because they don't fit with you, that moral codes are now seen to be the problem rather than solution. Emphasis on what we might call the right to psychological happiness of the individual also has some effects. For example, language will become much more contested than in the past because words can cause psychological harm, and they will be problematic, and they will need to be suppressed. To use pejorative slurs ceases to be a trivial matter. Instead, it becomes an extremely serious act of oppression. This explains why so much moral outrage in the public square is now directed at what one might call speech crimes. While earlier generations might have seen damage to body or property as the most serious categories of crime, a highly psychologized era will accord increasing importance to words as means of oppression. And this represents a serious challenge to one of the foundations of liberal democracy, freedom of speech. Yeah.
It's like the fellow said, we can get to the point where we're paranoid. Everybody's odd but me and thee, and sometimes I wonder about thee.
Sometimes, yeah. Everyone's odd but me and you, and sometimes I worry about you, yeah.
Well, I think we're headed, where God made very, very plain in His Word. And He said, every man has decided for himself
Mm-hmm.
what he thinks is right and wrong.
Exactly. Right in his own eyes.
There's no order,
Yeah.
because anybody can think what's right and wrong.
Yeah, you're talking about the bit from 1 Kings? Judges, thank you, Neil. Right. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And the author there is telling you, yeah, there's no king in Israel. Not including Yahweh. There's no king in Israel because everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes.
From the chat real quick,
Okay, we got 2 minutes left. Go.
from BJ Elkins.
Oh, hi BJ.
I've always thought that gender dysphoria came from a privileged position at the peak of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Do you think that our wealth is a factor in distorting our self-actualization?
Absolutely. So like what I think what BJ is getting at there, which by the way, BJ, we got your cards and your brochures. Everybody needs to pick one of those up. What BJ is getting at is that it takes a certain degree of comfort, I would even say boredom, before some of the more crazy ideas that we see apparent in our society become options.
We require struggle.
Yeah.
And if it is not there, we will provide it.
That's well said. We require struggle, and if our life's too comfortable, we'll make one up. How very interesting. Right. That's good. So you guys, welcome to stay and keep talking. For the sake of telling people to go and pick up their kids, so that because the nursery lets out, I'm going to pray and dismiss us, but you're still welcome to stick around and keep talking. Father, thank you so much for this time that you've given us. Thank you for these brothers and sisters of mine who I love so much, helping me and helping one another to think through these things well. And so we pray for that grace, that that you would use this time to equip us, not just to bemoan our culture, but to love our neighbors. That won't happen naturally. That's going to happen by grace. And so we ask for it now in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, everyone.